For all those who appreciate the work that we're doing here on Standing for Truth, please hit that subscribe button because we are just getting started. So first question here is, Professor McQueen, critics still claim fossilized footprints in the Grand Canyon are a problem for the global flood model, or in other words, let me see here. It came in a couple times actually, and it's also asked this way: that the skeptics ask, how can an animal that was supposed to be killed by a flood leave footprints in a flood layer after the fact?
Okay, with Ms. McQueen's help, she needed this Play-Doh for me, which I stole without apology since I bought it with my money from my grandchildren. So we'll use this to answer that. And I appreciate that question because it's an important question. If you want to look at this in great detail, go online and Google my former colleague at ICR, Dr. Steve Austin, and he's got a number of books that he's written about the geology of the Grand Canyon. The fossil footprints of reptiles and amphibians are found high in the canyon in a group of rocks, sandstones called the Coconino Sandstone, which is a very extensive layer of rock all through the American Southwest. Okay, so here's the flood geology explanation of that I've used for years. So at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, we have the green rocks, which would be called Creation Week rocks. The old German geologists that Darwin studied called these the Urgebirge, or the primitive rocks. There are no fossils in them. And then on top of that, you have, I hope you can see the blue there. The blue rocks are the rocks of the beginning of the flood. In the Grand Canyon, this is the Tapete Sandstone going up through the Red Wall Limestone. And these are what the old German geologists would call Übergangsgebirge. In other words, transitional. The words that Dr. Henry Morris used in the 50s is we've got primary rocks, secondary rocks, tertiary rocks, and quaternary. So in Europe, in America, there are these four divisions. What I call Creation Week, Flood Year, Post-Flood, and I have another division that we've talked about, post-flood, residual catastrophe, and so forth. But let's go back to the point of the question. So as you hike down the Grand Canyon, which I've done 5 times in 4 years, we would stop at the Coconino Sandstone, and on many of the trails, you can find footprints. And so here we've got these reptiles that are running away from the rising floodwaters. George, can you see the footprints of the little beasts there?
I certainly do, yep.
Okay, so they're running away. An hour later, another wave of the flood comes through and washes the wee beasties, the amphibians, the reptiles, wash them away. You don't find the bones with these footprints. You just find the footprints. Mm-hmm. Okay. As I have walked with my grandchildren on the beaches in South Mississippi, northern Florida, along the Caribbean Ocean, the Gulf of Mexico, I'll teach them this. We'll make footprints. There's the footprint of my grandson, Ian, who's now 13. But in the old days, he would walk with me without looking down at his tablet and cell phone, but I won't get into that. And so we'd walk along the beach, and he would leave his footprints. And I would say, Ian, turn around. And then 2 waves would come in and wash the footprints away. And so I would say to him, how could these footprints then be preserved? Well, they're preserved when the next wave of Noah's flood came in very quickly and buried these things. My partner in crime, George, is fond of using the phrase, "Oh, they've shot themselves in the foot."
Yes.
Well, this is the foot of those reptiles and amphibians. And for them to argue that slow processes over hundreds of years, thousands of years, could have preserved these, my grandfather McQueen had words for that are inappropriate. I can't say the words he had, but that's not a correct idea. That is, just a silly idea. The next wave came in, so you see the orange on top of the red there, and preserved these. The only way a dinosaur footprint can be preserved, the only way that these reptile and amphibian footprints can be preserved, is in a catastrophic model like flood geology. Comments, George, on that?
You're quite right. Also, the subsequent layer or wave that would have come through would have had suspended particles in it, almost a sludge, if you like, filling those footprints. So it's not if it's just water washing over those previously imprints, because as you mentioned, Professor McQueen, if they were the products of millions of years of deposition, and we covered this with cell geodina, where the secular explanation is deposition occurs at about 1 millimeter per 1,000 years, I believe, standing. I can't remember now, but when you compare that with the actual erosion rates, secular erosion rates of 6 centimeters per year, it just doesn't add up. It should not be there.
And let's always circle back to the Bible. And today's passage, if you want to follow along, is 2 Peter chapter 1:16. I sure wish I knew someone that understood the Greek of the New Testament, because we want to focus on a certain word that has a very interesting meaning in Greek, but I'll read it in English in the King James. For we have not followed cunningly devised fables when we made known unto you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but were eyewitnesses of his majesty. So our argument at Standing for Truth is the Bible is an eyewitness account of what occurred 6,000 years ago. But notice this phrase, George, cunningly devised fables. As I studied this, I found out that this word, fable, is the Greek word mythos. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but it's the word myth. And so our argument to the Standing for Truth class, as George and I think about it, or audience, is that the idea depicted by this photograph of the evolution from chimpanzee to ape to man is a fable. It's a modern philosophical fable. We must always be reminded that ideas have power and ideas have consequences. I do want to make one point, and we'll check this over the break. I think that your first graphic had Darwin dying in 1892. I think he actually died in 1882. Now, why in the world would I know that? It turns out my grandfather, H.H. McQueen, was born in 1883. So that's my link to Darwin. Okay, one more question, Standing for Truth, and then we'll go to George's presentation on racism.
Sure. Yeah, that was a fantastic answer. Very detailed, Professor McQueen. I think we might even make that into just a separate clip. Oftentimes we'll make shorter clips out of longer videos, especially because that's so common from the critic. Now, I've heard them, I guess just to leave no stone unturned, I've heard them say it this way, Professor McQueen, and there are people in the audience that are just curious as to your thoughts. What they say regarding the preserved footprints is that there are preserved footprints and tail marks that vertebrates made while walking over wet sand dunes. So they'll ask, how could these have formed and been preserved in the middle of a chaotic worldwide flood? Is that something that is a valid criticism in your opinion?
Yeah, and Not really, for this reason. Let's use, here we go. Here's a map of the United States, and you'll see down at the bottom the state. Let me put my finger on Louisiana here. It's going to be here someplace. There's Louisiana, and then Texas is to the west. And here is Florida, the peninsula of Florida. It's so hard to do this. There we go. There's the peninsula of Florida. Now, how does this help us to understand it? We have spoken previously about floating mats of plant debris that ended up incorporated in the rock record as coal measures. If you're outside the United States, these are called the Carboniferous deposits. If you've been taught geology in the United States, it's Mississippian, Pennsylvanian, Permian even, coal measures. So again, back to the Play-Doh. Let's use my hat here as an area in Texas, South Texas, called the Llano Uplift, which is a uplift of granite that occurred during the time of the flood, according to Dr. Snelling. And so you have a floating mat the size of Florida. That's the reason I showed you the map. A floating mat the size of Louisiana. So think about this. For me to drive to the state capitol is a 5-hour drive. So imagine a group of humans, which we'll illustrate here by this. So here's a group of humans standing a 5-hour drive, hundreds of miles away from a group of dinosaurs. So we'll take the cap off and we'll let this be the dinosaurs hundreds of miles away. This thing goes up against the Llano Uplift. The dinosaurs scamper off into micrite muds of the Glen Rose Formation found in the Paluxy River south of Dallas. They scamper off. Maybe a few hours later, maybe a day later, the humans walk over the same area and they leave human footprints along with dinosaur footprints. We'll save that discussion for another day. Let's go to point here, George. The point is, once these dinosaurs get off, they're washed away by the next wave, and the micrite mud precipitates out of the floodwaters and fills in the track. And so the geochemical, the carbonate petrology, the microstratigraphy of flood geology provides a perfectly adequate explanation for dinosaur footprints and tail drags when you do not find the dinosaur bones themselves. What do you think, George?
Great answer.
Yeah. I think Nephilim Free hit the nail on the head. His comment says if ancient Greek and Roman stone buildings can erode so that their edges are rounded in 2,500 years or less, then no fossil footprint will exist in 1,000,000 years unless it is quickly buried in sediments. This is what we keep saying. Fossilization is a process. It requires quick burial through deep sedimentation. And that's the only way it can happen.